Hello, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our event on LGBT Humanists UK history. My name is Chris Lynch, and I am the coordinator of LGBT Humanists, and it's delightful to see so many people here joining us on this lovely sunny evening. I'll introduce my my fellow panelists. So I'm delighted to be joined by Maddie Goodall. Maddie Goodall is the director of the Humanist Heritage Project, which for some years now has produced incredibly high quality and insightful resources, history, and publications all about the history of humanism, secularism, atheism, and other movements within the United Kingdom, unearthing, amongst many other things, the very, very prominent and very important history of LGBT humanists and its predecessors in the 20th century and before. We're also joined by Andrew Coxon, who is the Chief Executive of Humanists UK, a role that he also oversees the Humanists International. Andrew is also a former chair himself of GALHA, the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association as it was then. And I'm delighted to be joined by both speakers. The history of LGBT humanists is a history that in many ways reflects many of the trends, the struggles, and also the successes of free thinking and people challenging orthodoxies to defend rights and liberties more generally across the last 2 centuries or so in the United Kingdom. It's been particularly interesting whilst preparing for this event, seeing quite how many continuous threads there are in the work of both humanists with a small h, people who seek to live ethical and fulfilling lives on the basis of reason and humanity, and work for a rational world where kindness and rational thinking prevail. How many of these figures, and those within the capital H LGBT humanist movement have sought to challenge and also to address rather similar themes. As we'll go on to see, there have been LGBT humanists as long as there have been humanists and LGBT people, and as long as there have been struggles to assert the rights, freedoms, and equality of people more widely. But it's true that there are certain continuous threads that will emerge as we dive into this history in a bit more detail. One of the most prominent ones surrounds attempts to debunk so-called cures for homosexuality, particularly, but also bisexuality and gender nonconformity. This is very much still a current issue. We at LGBT Humanists are very, very proud of the history over 40 years of being very much at the vanguard of fighting against supposed conversion therapy. And although very recently there has been something of a breakthrough legally with the government being forced under pressure from LGBT plus charities and advocates to seek to institute a ban, unfortunately that ban completely has left out any support for trans people, and has also applied only in contexts where the therapy, so-called therapy, is directed at those under 18 who apparently have not been able to consent. This is both unacceptable and morally really rather horrific, but also a very strange violation from standard practice of how pseudoscientific and unproven medical interventions are treated otherwise within the law. Alongside that, there is also a very proud and rather happier history of affirmations and celebrations of same-sex love and relationships. LGBT humanists for many, many years have been affirming, notice affirming rather than blessing with its religious connotations, same-sex relationships long before same-sex marriage was ever legalized anywhere within the United Kingdom. We were indeed very, very pleased to be again, at the forefront of campaigns to eventually bring about that change in the law, though. We have also seen in the long history of LGBT humanists the ability to provide fellowship and community and to campaign and organise around issues that affect not just those from marginalised communities, but also the rights and freedoms of the general population at large, surrounding inequalities, attempts to challenge blasphemy, so-called blasphemy laws. As you'll see, that's part of the bizarre and frankly fascinating origin story of the group. And alongside and underpinning all of that work has been a very real and very deeply cherished ethics of compassion. One of our former vice presidents, Maureen Duffy, who was one of the first women, as we'll go on to hear about, to be publicly open in public life as a lesbian, spoke to a gathering of what was then the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association on the vital role of an ethics of compassion in a world where religious homophobia and transphobia continue to wreak moral havoc and tragedy in many, many people's lives. This is a story then of people getting angry and getting organised. It's a story of international networking and cooperation. It's a story of demanding inclusive and objective media representation and teaching within schools, and seeking to challenge those voices of bigotry and of discrimination in many, many different arenas of life. It's true that within LGBT humanists' history, there have been many, many great triumphs, and you'll no doubt have noticed that we are hosting this event on the eve of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia, an important date in the calendar that actually sees a huge event that we were pivotal in helping to set up. And with that, I hand over to Maddie.
Thanks very much, Chris. I feel very inspired by that, and also actually it picks up on, well, it draws together very nicely, dare I say, frames all of the things that I'll hopefully be able to add a bit more detail to. So thanks very much for such a great introduction. So we've recently started, you may know, releasing a history of humanism in 100 objects. So needless to say, I couldn't resist making this through the medium of objects as well, although you'll see that I've cheated quite a lot because there are multiple objects on most of the slides, has to be admitted now. But in any case, this is a brief jaunt through a slightly longer history of LGBT humanist activism, which, as Chris said, has ever been rooted in what Duffy referred to as this ethics of compassion, grounded in reason, and of course in love as well. So I'm going to start off with Edward Carpenter's sandals. So Edward Carpenter was born in 1844. He was a socialist, a poet, a writer, and a philosopher who, even though he was once ordained as a curate for the Church of England, left the ministry and ultimately embraced a decidedly alternative lifestyle, of which his sandals were just a part, are just one representative part. The year before this particular sandal template was created, however, Carpenter had privately circulated a pamphlet which was called Homogenic Love, in which he wrote about his hope for a wise humanity, drawing inspiration from science, which could shed a light on things that might seem unfamiliar to some people and give us a greater understanding of them, and also from love, which could recognise the validity, importantly, of variation in society. The leaning of sexual desire to one of the same sex, he wrote in this pamphlet, is in a vast number of cases quite instinctive and congenital, mentally and physically, and therefore twined in the very roots of individual life and practically ineradicable. To cast a slur upon this kind of love, he argued, would be a most irrational thing to do. In that same pamphlet, he took examples from throughout history, from the ancient world, through Shakespeare, of course, and through lots of other examples of literature. So he's very much a part of that, drawing on that much longer evidence of same-sex love and same-sex attraction all the way through history that Chris mentioned in the beginning of this event. Carpenter himself lived with his partner George Merrill from 1898 until Merrill's death in 1928, and their relationship in part inspired E.M. Forster's novel Maurice. So there they are together in what is just a great image. Many UK figures, including Carpenter, drew inspiration from Europe, where there was a lot more, I guess, research going on, and also active efforts to bring about change in the law as well. One such figure was Magnus Hirschfield, whose Scientific Humanitarian Committee had been founded in Germany with the motto, which I'm always scared to say because I'm not a Latin speaker or reader, it has to be said, per scientiam ad justitiam. Okay, Andrew's nodding, which means justice through science or through knowledge to justice. And among the aims of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee were the abolition of Germany's anti-gay laws, the promotion of public education about homosexuality, and also the encouragement of the LGBT community to take up the struggle for their rights. Under Magnus Hirschfield's leadership, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee gathered over 5,000 signatures from prominent Germans on a petition to overturn what was called paragraph 175, which criminalised homosexual acts between men. And signatories of that petition included Albert Einstein, Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, and Max Brod, who was a close friend of Franz Kafka. Notably for us and for the history of humanist LGBT activism, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee took a rationalist, reformist approach to laws regarding sex and sexuality, which prefigured and then interacted with a British organisation, which was led and populated largely by humanists and free thinkers. So next is a little bit more of a abstract one, perhaps, more light. The British Society for the Study of Sexual Psychology was originally formed on the 12th of August 1913 as the British Society of Psychiatry, and among its founders were Edward Carpenter, Magnus Hirschfield, and Lawrence Houseman, who was a vice president of the Ethical Union, as Humanists UK then was, along with other activists and thinkers and writers. It became the British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology and later the British Sexological Society, but it aimed to advance a particularly radical agenda in the field of sex reform by discussing sex rationally and on the basis of science and not superstition. In 1918, humanist and feminist Stella Brown wrote an article about the BSSSP in the International Journal of Ethics, which had itself been founded by leaders of the international ethical movement, in which she discussed the origins and the efforts of the group, which arose, she said, from the need for unprejudiced and thorough investigation of sexuality. However grudgingly and imperfectly, Brown wrote, light was being at last let into some of the dark places where life still agonised and decayed, and the initiators of the British Society for the Study of Sex Psychology felt the need for more light, and particularly in the case of members of the specially privileged and responsible medical, legal and educational professions. The BSSSP held meetings, facilitated discussion, and published on a range of topics relating to sex, sexuality, and law reform. And Houseman later wrote that it had been instrumental in helping to form a new public opinion or a new open-mindedness towards sex. In 1929, members of the BSSSP were active in the World League for Sexual Reform, some of whose key figures you can see on the right here. And the Congress of that organisation was held in London that year. And Dora Russell, one of my personal favourite humanist women, later wrote that there we had passed resolutions on marriage and divorce, sex and censorship, sex education, birth control, abortion, prostitution, and venereal disease, which might serve as the basis for a tolerant and humane society, some of which have even yet not been realised. This was in the 80s. But we had, as Hirschfield urged upon us, broken through the conspiracy of silence. Now, of course, the Wolfenden Committee was established in 1954 to investigate the legality of homosexuality and prostitution in a year when imprisonments under the existing laws governing homosexuality had risen to over 1,000 per year. The Ethical Union, as Humanists UK was then, submitted evidence to the Wolfenden Committee, advocating reform on the basis that the law had no business interfering in private conduct between consenting adults. Ultimately, that is what the committee agreed, concluding that there must remain a realm of private morality and immorality, which is, in brief and crude terms, not the law's business, and recommending decriminalisation. A number of prominent humanists before and after the report's publication pushed for reform and continued to push for reform, which was, it has to be said, fairly slow in coming, even on the recommendations of the committee. The letter seen here on the right, which appeared in the Times, expressed the hope that the government will introduce legislation to give effect to the proposed reform at an early date. And humanist signatories on this letter included A.J. Ayer, Isaiah Berlin, Julian Huxley, Stephen Spender, Bertrand Russell, and Barbara Wootton. And a number of those became active supporters of the campaign for homosexual equality when that came into being as well. This particular book, Live and Let Live, was authored by Eustace Chesser, also a humanist, and as the title suggests, had a Live and Let Live response to the moral of the Wolfenden report. Now to the founding documents, perhaps, of what was initially the Gay Humanist Group. And it was at the CHE conference of 1979 that the Gay Humanist Group was officially launched, although it was the outcome of discussions that had been happening ever since the blasphemy prosecution, which had been brought by Mary Whitehouse against gay news, which Whitehouse had won in 1977, the first prosecution of its kind for 50 years at that stage. Whitehouse had accused a gay humanist lobby of being behind the backlash, a lobby which didn't exist, but could, and then did. And in the year of its formation, the Gay Humanist Group's newsletter included a warning about the evangelical Christian charity, the Pilot Trust, and its so-called counselling activities. So very immediately launching into the kinds of campaigns that are still very relevant today. As stated in its constitution, the Gay Humanist Group sought to promote an understanding and awareness of humanism among gay people, to further an understanding and awareness of gay people among humanists, and to protect and promote the rights of gays and humanists. And this was very much seen as a double battle, with both groups frequently accused of or immorality. So it was important that those two allied with each other. And moving swiftly on to some of the other archival evidence for the early work of the Gay Humanist Group. The archive at the Bishopsgate today holds this letter from the MP David Wilshire, who introduced the notorious Section 28 amendment to the Local Government Bill, which sought to prevent the promotion of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. In this letter, he seeks to assure Jim Herrick that it isn't bigotry or hostility which motivates him. Nevertheless, Gay Humanist Group members were among those who actively resisted the legislation, which was only finally repealed in England and Wales in 2003. Throughout the 1980s and onwards, LGBT humanists called attention to and campaigned against discrimination in all its forms, including challenging misinformation and hate around AIDS, and protesting Christian counselling by bodies like, as mentioned, the True Freedom Trust and U-Turn Anglia, which was run by a man whose own son had killed himself as a result of being unable to reconcile his sexuality and his faith, or indeed the faith of his father. Next, we come to this great portrait of E.M. Forster, which was given to Conway Hall by what was by then the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association to mark their 10th anniversary and to show gratitude for many years of hosting by Conway Hall. Social events, meetings, fairs and public debates all took place there. And although E.M. Forster was not open about his sexuality during his lifetime, he was actively involved in a range of activities for civil liberties and human rights, as well as being a very prominent voice for humanism. And in that sense, this portrait in Forster himself is a reminder of the wide-ranging efforts of LGBT humanists for the decades before and since the creation of the Gay Humanist Group itself. Moving then, again, another abstract one, the Hearth Rug. So beyond campaigning and activism, as Chris mentioned, LGBT humanists were also pioneering in their offer of secular ceremonies of all kinds. In the face of the backlash against lesbians and gays from reactionary forces capitalising on the AIDS crisis, GALHA organised, promoted and performed affirmation ceremonies for gay couples. Particularly notable was the 1987 live broadcast of such a ceremony, for which GALHA provided the script, which was broadcast on Network 7, featuring, as George Broadhead described, the first close-up gay smoocher on TV. This script was used again for a mass gay wedding held at London's Hippodrome nightclub, and in many more across the UK. And I've chosen the Hearth Rug here because it is something that ties together many visions and descriptions of early humanist ceremonies conducted in living rooms and people's homes across the UK, as well as same-sex commitment ceremonies. Humanist celebrants led naming and affirmation ceremonies for trans people as well. So in all of these areas, it was humanist celebrants who were, again, as Chris said, at the vanguard of so many of these things. Of course, it would be impossible to resist including this cake from 2004's 25th anniversary celebrations, which includes this unforgettable image of Mary Whitehouse. The group often described themselves as being born of Mary, in a nod to Whitehouse's early influence on their formation, as mentioned before. And it is notable that Whitehouse was a particularly prominent, but not lone voice in her fears about some kind of gay humanist lobby putting pay to all that was good and holy in the world. And as Anthony Gray wrote in a later work of his, and Anthony Gray did also speak for the Gay Humanist Group. In 1980, Valerie Riches of the Responsible Society, as it was called, described a devilish plot involving a tremendously powerful network of some 35 agencies, which included governmental departments, the Health Education Council, family planning agencies, the Communist Party, humanist organisations, and the Sexual Law Reform Society, all of whom, she said, engaged in deliberately promoting teenage promiscuity and sexual irresponsibility. I don't really know what it is, said Mrs. Riches. Communism, humanism, world domination? I don't know, but I do know it's happening, and it's terribly clever. Cakes feature quite nicely, as you can see in this other picture, of our first, or LGBT Humanist first president, Maureen Duffy, cutting the cake at the 5th anniversary celebration of the Gay Humanist Group. And Chris mentioned her great talk for the group, her first presidential address, in which she talked about this ethics of compassion. And finally, and I think Andrew will pick up a bit on this after I conclude, I would like to mention, meeting as we are on the eve of the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia, that it is important to note that the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Group played an early and an outsized role for a group of their size in organising activities around the commemoration, around Idaho, as it was called then, from its outset. Derek Leonard is a former chair of LGBT Humanists and was UK coordinator for Idaho. And the kind of events that they were putting on as soon as Idaho was first introduced in 2005 included film screenings, debates, talks, and kiss-ins even. And although the play shown here wasn't produced for Idaho celebrations, it does show the importance of community, of creativity and history and fun, which has also been such a big part of LGBT humanists throughout its existence. And just to conclude on that, I would like to play a short extract of Derek himself talking about this. He couldn't be here today, but I have spoken to him previously about his involvement with the group. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to hear this, but he's very softly spoken, so you might need to lean in or turn up. And hopefully one or other of my co-panelists will give me a thumbs up as and when they can hear this. So this is Derek Leonard talking about his time with GALHA.
Another thing to say perhaps is, I did allude to, most of us who have friends in GALHA met at public meetings. As part of our history, an important part of our history, even those outside London who'd come down especially for events. And there's a big network of friends who have that experience now and are in our 60s, 70s, even 80s, and who go on holiday together and go out for nice meals together. And those public meetings are quite an important part of our memory, even of our identity. That's a sort of comradeship of humanism has some sort of meaning.
Thanks very much, and I will hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Maddie. Absolutely fascinating. Actually, not at all a surprise, because all of the work that you've been doing for the Humanist Heritage Project has been absolutely compelling and turned up some remarkable facts and artifacts that were previously unknown, and that was no different. I think my contribution would be sensible to do two things. One, to go a little bit wider than the details of the history we've just heard, and talk a little bit about, as it were, the foundations in the humanist approach to life that LGBT humanist activism has, and some of the outsized influences and really avant-garde campaigns and aims that LGBT humanists have had in their campaigning work. And then I suppose, since, as Chris said, I was myself involved on the committee of GALHA as it was, as no doubt some of those who are here with us virtually were as well. And I look forward to their questions and comments in this regard too. But as I was so involved, to give a little bit more of a personal account, an insight into those activities that, as Derek said, personally for him, and as Maddie has made reference to as a matter of historical record for lots of the people who are involved, were relationships of real solidarity and had a very galvanizing effect. So I start by going a little bit wider. I think that it's no accident that humanist organizations all over the world, wherever they are, from Uganda and Ghana to the Philippines and to Latin America and to Europe and North America too, it's no accident that those groups are now, as they've always been, in the vanguard of LGBT rights and the promotion of the rights and freedoms of LGBT people. It's no accident because a commitment to LGBT rights is an inevitable conclusion of the humanist approach. There's two things I think that in the humanist approach to life and to understanding the universe and our place in it and to understanding ourselves, there's two aspects to the humanist approach that draw us towards the struggle for liberation and equality and freedom for LGBT people. One is that obviously a humanist approach to life is based explicitly and completely and on nothing else other than a scientific and a rational and evidence-based view of how the world is. And that doesn't just apply to understanding stars and planets and the weather and those sorts of phenomena. It applies to understanding ourselves as well. When we try to understand ourselves, no less than when we try to understand the universe, we look to reason, evidence, and science to make sense of this. And any application of that, any objective application of those tools and resources to the question of sexual orientation towards people of the same sex, or of gender identities that are at variance with the gender identity that you are physically sexed as, are natural phenomena, that they occur in our own species and in other species as well, and that they are, there is nothing, as it were, abnormal in the pejorative sense about those things. There's hardly, in relation to sexual orientation, there's hardly a species of animal in which we don't see same-sex activity or same-sex orientations. And that tells us straight away that this sort of love, this sort of attraction, this sort of behavior is not an aberration from some natural state, but in fact something that is widespread. And that removes the condemnation of those, especially of those who look to sort of an unnatural taboo, to look to a taboo of unnaturalness around gay people in particular. Humanists don't, so I think it's equally obvious that we would not judge. But the second and maybe more important feature of a humanist approach that should lead us in this direction towards LGBT equality is nothing to do with science and reason, but is a matter of ethics, a matter of values. Not, I think, wholly to do with compassion, as Maureen said, although the idea of an ethics of compassion is extremely important. It's the connection between people based on human solidarity that sits at the heart of humanist social morality. But it's not so much compassion, as far as I'm concerned, as a matter of freedom and justice. You know, it's core to a humanist idea of how the human being individually should be treated in society, to say that everyone should have, in this one life that we have, the maximum opportunity to be as happy and as fulfilled and as complete as possible, because it's the only chance you have. And in that context, humanists have always advocated for the maximum possible freedom of choice, as much as freedom of thought and expression for each person, the maximum that is compatible with the rights and freedoms of others. And as long as you're not harming others in the course of your expression or your behavior or the goals that you adopt or the way you live your life, and then you should be free to do whatever you wish. And that would be the case even if homosexuality, for example, were some unnatural product of particular circumstances. It still wouldn't matter as far as humanist ethics is concerned, because that question of freedom and fulfillment would be the same. Well, that, I think, is just naturally where a humanist approach to things takes us. Why then did it take so long for humanists to adopt explicitly the goals of campaigning for equality for LGBT people? Maddie's given us really good account, I think, of this story of sort of these three waves, or I like to see them as three waves. This isn't how Maddie might disagree, and maybe that's fruitful for the discussion afterwards. But I like to see just three waves of humanist LGBT activism. Firstly, there is that wave of that sort of love-driven, ethically driven, idealistic motion of Edward Carpenter and the others. You know, they think of wider questions of human equality and see the equality of people who are same-sex attracted as part of that. You know, we will all live together and be at peace and, you know, settle the inequalities between us that society has produced, that aren't natural in the mind of Edward Carpenter, but that society has produced, the way it's structured itself, in its economy, in its politics, in its institutions, and that we'll instead of that build our bonds on love, and as much on the bonds of love between two men and two women as on any other kind of love. That sort of first wave of LGBT activism, which of course Ian Forster is part of, as much as the documenter of, in his own life too. That's an important first wave of humanist LGBT awareness, I think. And then the second wave, as I say it, is in the 20th century, later mid 20th century, when things become political in the UK. As Maddie said, there's much more politics in Germany before this, but I think the explicit politics comes a bit later in the UK. Fighting for reform of the law. Obviously, that focuses around decriminalisation, and really straight humanists were the first allies of gay people in relation to that fight. As Maddie pointed out, A.J. Ayer, president of the British Humanist Association, one of the key driving forces in the campaign for decriminalisation of homosexuality, he said he was the perfect front man for this movement. As some of you may know, he made a joke. He was a notorious womanizer, many affairs, and he said that he was the perfect frontman for this campaign for decriminalising homosexuality, because no one could accuse him of being self-interested in his waging of this campaign. And he made a joke of it, but they were that's real solidarity amongst those humanist straight allies of gay people at that time, and the social taboo and social opprobrium that arose from their solidarity with gay people at the time. And then I think there's a sort of third wave of activism now, where I'll talk about this in a moment more, but a third wave now where we still remain, unfortunately, as we've seen in recent months in particular, we still remain out in front on a lot of the issues that are now not just about decriminalisation and acceptance, but more and more about justice and accommodation and inclusion of LGBT people as of right, not only in society, but in a number of other institutions. But as I said a moment ago, it didn't automatically happen that every single humanist or every member of a humanist organisation in the mid-20th century was a full-throated advocate for LGBT equality. And in fact, I remember Jim Herrick, who Maddie mentioned, and who was prominent, who had prominence in humanist organisations other than the Gay Humanist Group. In fact, there's hardly a humanist organisation where he wasn't an extremely important part of their movement, saying to me that when he went along to some BHA events even in the later 20th century, there were those who questioned why we should really be concerned with this, who were very sceptical of same-sex, the gay agenda, and so on and so forth. Thankfully, they could be reasoned with by virtue of their humanist convictions. But this brings me then to the significance and the outsized influence of the Gay Humanist Group and gay organising within humanist organisations, because it was necessary for there to be people who pointed out to humanists the necessary outworkings and consequences of those humanist beliefs, who said to those people, we're all humanists here, we all agree people should be free, that we base our views on evidence, that we have a social morality that is, as Maureen Duffy said, about compassion, or as others from the Gay Humanist Group said, about justice. And this is part and parcel of who we are as humanists and what we should be doing. And that undoubtedly was the influence of the Gay Humanist Group and then the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association, before it became LGBT Humanists and became part of Humanists UK, as an independent organisation advocating for those acceptances within the humanist organisation. It was absolutely pivotal. In itself, it had policy effects on those main humanist organisations and the secular society too. It was notable that Terry Sanderson, for example, who was many years an activist within and then the president of the National Secular Society, was also someone I sat with on the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association committee, as were many other people who were prominent in other humanist
organisations, it had that type of influence and impact on those other organisations. But it also had policy influences. There's no doubt at all that mainstream humanist organisations were assisted in being in favour of same-sex marriage, in being in favour of the inclusion of LGBT and anti-discrimination laws in the Equality Act, being in favour of the ban on conversion therapy by the existence of the Gay Humanist Group. But it also, as we heard from Derek, and this is my main experience of it too, had an enormously beneficial social effect, a sort of solidarity, a sort of camaraderie, a sort of community that people getting involved in it benefited from enormously, and was a huge source of enrichment and fulfillment in their lives. I think the friends that I made when I got involved, really, still friends now, and you have a depth of connection with them based not just on fundamental belief and all the commonality and connection that creates, but also the experience of sexual orientation and of living in a society where that sexual orientation is not the norm, and the experiences that you have as a gay person. Those two things together, they create such deep and profound connections between people. And I think everyone who was a member of or involved in GALHA and LGBT Humanists would think that. There was something very special for me about the intergenerational nature of that. It was possible for me as a young man in his 20s to be spending time with social time and intellectual time and campaigning time with people, born, well, many, many decades before I was myself, and having had experiences that in the absence for many of them of children or grandchildren, it's not like today when gay and lesbian people can have, much more likely to have children and have descendants and so on. That sort of almost family connection that you can get from people, and the stories that they pass on to you, as your grandparents might pass stories on, connect you with the past. Not in that case, not in the cases with grandparents, the stories of your own family and feeling that connectedness through your time. But in this case, feeling a connectedness of another kind, connectedness with a cause, with an idea, with an experience. And that sort of sentiment is something I think that was extremely valuable. And I hope that as time goes on, especially post-pandemic, that might be something that we see again in LGBT humanists, because the social connections and the fellowship and the solidarity that engendered was really one of the things I think that drove the policy priorities and galvanized the campaigns and motivated people to be active. When we had the lunches where we sat together once a year to give an award to someone who'd been particularly prominent or particularly courageous or had made a particular contribution, and we recognized in that context the founders of Moscow Pride, who were so brave, or the founder of the International Day Against Homophobia from France. And really, Derek was very modest, I think, in his interview with Maddie, which we didn't hear the whole of, but with his interview. If it hadn't been for him, there wouldn't have been an International Day Against Homophobia in the UK at all, by the way. And it was GALHA what won it. There was no one interested in celebrating International Day Against Homophobia until GALHA brought it to the UK. And now the rainbow flag flies from every government building on that day, or at least it has in the past. Let's hope it will continue to do so. But meeting people like that, or when we recognised Angela Eagle for her particular work as one of the first, she's the first something, I can't remember what, she's the first lesbian frontbencher or the first lesbian first out lesbian in Parliament, I think, to be elected to Parliament, that's right, I think. Or Patrick Strudwick, for example, when he came to us at lunch and spoke about his experience of undergoing conversion therapy and the way that he exposed that and the way he led those campaigns. All of those people that I've just mentioned sparked for us in GALHA, and then a spark which lit fires in secular organisations and humanist organisations that took up these campaigns. All of these people spoke first at lunches, drinks, events where people were brought together in fellowship, as I say, in community. And it was in that on that sort of foundation that the will and the motivation to make these changes and to improve society and to change individuals' lives for the better and to seek justice for LGBT people, not just here and around the world, that's the foundation on which those things were built. So I think there's something incredibly special about that experience, not just for personal fulfillment in all the ways that I say, in the enrichment of one's own life and experiences and the connections that come from it personally, but also as the seedbed through that solidarity of campaigning change. And humanist organisations, began historically as congregations. We don't congregate anymore in the same way, but there is something in that model of organisation and the connections it generates that can benefit enormously the campaigns that we seek to pursue. So that was certainly what I got out of it personally. I think it's what the historical record shows, helped it to generate these causes which have been so successful. And I hope that perhaps in its new incarnation as LGBT humanists, now the pandemic is over in particular, is something that might, the time of which might come again.
Thank you very, very much to Maddie and Andrew there. Whilst we open up the floor to questions, please do feel free to use the Q&A function to pose any. I wonder whether I might also notice one or two particular moments in both Maddie's and Andrew's comments there, and perhaps start to suggest even more of the very, very rich history here and very, very fecund material for future before we hear some questions and have some discussion. I do think it's true that once you hear the story of how, as it was then, the Gay Humanist Group came to exist, it's very, very hard to forget it. And of course, the idea that Mary Whitehouse herself almost sowed the seeds for this supposed, gay humanist intellectual lobby that was some shadowy organisation seeking to destroy everything good and true, as she said, is one that in and of itself is very local to that particular moral panic moment in Britain's history, but is also something indicative, I think, as both Andrew and Maddie said in various different ways, of how this is a very, very ever-present struggle, and how actually even today there remain huge fights to be fought, and we at LGBT Humanists continue to organise around those things and keep our powder dry. In fact, George Broadhead, who we've mentioned already, one of the founding members who passed away fairly recently, he once said that the small and fragile gains which the gay movement has made within the past decade, this was in 1979, at the Campaign for Homosexual Equality's annual conference in Brighton, he said, the small and fragile gains which the gay movement has made within the past decade can and perhaps will be so readily taken away. And of course, as we know, with the 70s and what seemed to be a gradual religious reawakening of particularly quite dangerous in some ways, and certainly quite reactionary right-wing forces with religious aggrandizement behind them. We saw the nationwide Festival of Light, which is now Christian Action Research and Education, which continues today alongside lobbying groups like the Christian Institute to be very, very active in lobbying against both lesbian and gay rights and any rights and grounds won by non-religious people in this country. And so all of that does paint a picture, I think, of how today we have never really been we've never really been more urgently needed. And perhaps before I do hand over to one or two questions, as I can see there are some really, really interesting things coming through, particularly about international angles, and Anirudh has asked, in fact, what are the main causes that the LGBT Humanists Group are fighting today, and how are we doing that? Within the work that we do today, both around campaigning and activism, also around community organising and around providing dignified fellowship and ceremony, while some of that work has been embedded within Humanists UK, particularly around the very visible celebrants' work and ceremonies across the country, we remain one of the leading voices, and we sit in fact, the pretty much all of the bodies of committee against so-called conversion therapy, and we continue to be on the coalition against it, and we continue to punch above our weight in being so vocally positioned in finding data and in protesting against it. In fact, we were at the recent demonstrations that brought huge awareness, actually, to the fact that trans voices were yet again not included in that legislation. And also, increasingly, we are shedding light on abuse in other care home settings that is explicitly homophobic, biphobic, transphobic, and fueled by religious bigotries. We are looking ever more at the situation of LGBT elder people in care homes and nursing settings, and drawing attention to how in so many of these apparently secular spaces, both religious influence and often the two clearly can and do go together, anti-LGBT influence seem to be making people's lives a misery. We've also had a long history of seeking objective, factually based PSHE in relationships and sex education in schools. And we, as Andrew said, we were avant-garde in many things, and that was yet another one that, as a small lobbying organisation, we were successful in providing evidence, and alongside Humanists UK in reporting on schools that were still using in 2013 Section 28-like language in their policies, that still seems to have discriminatory and homophobic and transphobic approaches to bullying and to pastoral care, or lack thereof, frankly. And so, alongside all of those historical themes, much of that remains very, very current and adjusts as time goes on. We're also very proud of our history in fighting in an outsized influence again against Section 28. We are mindful, though, that there remain very, very prominent challenges still, as we saw 2 years ago with the Birmingham Schools campaigns. And so we continue to be present and to be vocal against all of those, and hopefully also for people's rights to live freely without in any way violating the rights of others, a core humanist and liberal principle. I've said rather a lot there, so I'm going to now field back to questions. Andrew, I noticed you'd perhaps like to come in a little bit more on that before we perhaps look at. Sean has asked a very interesting question about severe crackdowns on LGBT rights in China and Russia, which we can come to after that, perhaps.
No, I think actually you've covered all the current campaigns pretty well. I think one of the benefits of the last few years of when GALHA made the decision to become LGBT Humanists and then to become part of Humanists UK is that we've been able to work together on a lot of those important issues and sort of mainstream the LGBT angle into a lot of the general campaign. So you're absolutely right that, when you're looking at sex and relationships education, there's a whole load of issues. I mean, sex and relationship education is just pretty dire, and the legislative situation, I've only been drinking water, until very recently, has been, really bad in general. And so that's something that Humanists UK has campaigned on always. And then LGBT Humanists UK can add the insightful, specific aspects in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. So I think that you've covered that pretty comprehensively. I suppose the only thing I'd add is the more international dimensions as well that that Humanists UK can campaign in, and the intersection of those things sometimes. I mean, Humanists UK helps a lot of people who are seeking asylum in the UK for their non-religious beliefs. Now, a disproportionately large number of those are also gay. And so, that's been an area where, again, the mainstreaming of LGBT humanist concerns into Humanists UK's campaigns and services has been particularly successful. Conversion therapy, I think, conversion so-called therapy, I think a lot of problems are caused by us continuing to use the word therapy in relation to these practices. conversion practices, which are, pseudoscientific and cause immense psychological and personal harm. This is obviously, I think, the most important campaign that LGBT humanists currently pursuing. In the same way that, on a big scale of bioethical issues, assisted dying is probably the great big next thing for as it were, general bioethical issues. Conversion practices and the criminalization of them, which has been promised now and heralded now for so long, must be the big, as yet unwon aim for LGBT humanists, I think. And it's the most annoying campaign on one, because it's so simple to do. A lot of people cause a lot of completely unnecessary complication around this. And we've always said at LGBT Humanists, when we were GALHA and beforehand as well, it's really very simple to define what you want to ban. It is any attempt any attempt at therapy or practices, the intention of which is to achieve some sort of predetermined change in sexual orientation, or in the case of gender identity and gender identity. And that's so easy to frame. That law is so easy to frame without criminalizing any of the things that you want to allow to continue in a free society, and the sort of open-ended therapies that you want to continue in a free society. That I'm constantly astonished why it hasn't yet been banned. I think one of the roles that LGBT Humanists UK has played in the last 30 years, and LGBT Humanists have been campaigning on this, as Maddie said, for 40 years, but one of the important roles in the last 30 years in particular has been in exposing the complicity of religious groups in particular with these practices, and shaming and embarrassing them, especially in the 90s and noughties, into giving up at least open support for these practices. It seems really shocking now to think that the Bishop of Oxford, the then Bishop of Oxford, who is a good liberal, and is supported the campaign to end collective worship when it was discussed in the House of Lords last year. But when he was Bishop of Oxford just 30 years ago, defended the right of his church halls and churches to hire themselves out for and to host conversion therapy activities for gay people. It's not long at all. And GALHA was the organisation that was calling him out. You look through the press clippings archive, as Maddie does, for her projects, and you find, it's George Broadhead of GALHA all the time. And those of us who remember him know that, that's what he liked, getting his words out there constantly. And it's always George Broadhead of GALHA who's criticizing these people and these practices publicly. And that sort of work is incredibly important at shifting public perceptions, and it's unseen by history quite often, that sort of social change work that goes on by being constantly persuasive, constantly exposing public and ever greater audiences to these arguments. I think that's incredibly important, and I hope that it's something that LGBT humanists will be able to carry on campaigning on.
Indeed. I mean, we back in November had a meeting where we were privileged to hear from two survivors separately of one another of so-called conversion therapy. And what then became very clear from the discussion that followed was quite how widespread and quite how unexpectedly widespread for many people these sorts of horrific practices are. And we have been out there on the front lines with campaign actions. We've been writing to MPs when the original consultations were opened and then closed again and forestalled and then opened again. And as you say, the government has systematically seemed to renege on much of its promise on so-called conversion therapy and banning it. We publicised that the campaign they call it conversion therapy, we call it homophobic religious abuse, and we have been very resolute, in fact, in insisting that it is torture, and look forward to, maybe not look forward, but are nonetheless insistent that will be a centerpiece of what we are continuing to do as hopefully our social media activity and other places continues to signpost. There was a question which touched on international situations, particularly in China and Russia. So Sean asked, does we see a concerning rise in anti-LGBT hate groups on the far right in the West and increasingly severe crackdowns on LGBT rights in China and Russia? What can LGBT humanists learn from its history for the struggles of the future? And I suppose before I defer to Maddie or Andrew on that if they wish to come in. I mean, one thing that we've not mentioned as much is the international dialogue and networking that LGBT Humanists and in its former guises as the Gay Humanist Group and as GALHA has always enjoyed. There were articles in 1985 in the Pink Triangle Trust's archives of members of the as it was the Gay Humanist Group then, meeting up with members of their Dutch equivalent and going off to the seaside, but also whilst having fun and frolicking in the sunshine, they were also having really quite morally urgent discussions about how to protect the rights that had been won, given that this was in the early years of the AIDS crisis, talking about important healthcare initiatives as well, and seeking to build further coalitions, particularly with the USA. I know that, as we've mentioned, George Broadhead, but other people around the Pink Triangle Trust and the founding membership of the GHD and of GALHA were closely involved with Nigeria and Uganda, and we've continued to have links with them. There is a classroom, I think I'm right in saying it still bears the name of George Broadhead in Uganda as a project that was funded and supported by our members. And so clearly there is a very real history there that we can celebrate and hopefully use to prefigure our international work that can be done both behind the scenes, where helpful with people on the ground in those countries, but also in signposting from our side here in the UK what people can and should do to campaign and to put pressure on our government's relationships with those countries. I wonder if Maddie or Andrew wants to come in on that one.
Oh, we've both
have an international dimension there, Maddie.
I was just going to say, I think Chris has touched on it anyway, but certainly what the archives bear out is that, I guess, solidarity, dialogue, and kind of events and awareness raising that is the case in the kind of international dimension of all of those. So as well as the Dutch group, for example, the Gay Atheist League of America were quite a lot of international exchange, I suppose, and kind of fellowship between the two groups there. And
the Nordic Rainbow, there was a Nordic Rainbow group, I remember, or some name like that, the Nordic Rainbow Humanists. I went to speak at their conference in Sweden. They were immensely lovely people. Yeah,
and that's as you say, members from one group going to speak to another, and people from one country or one group coming and even doing research in the archives and things at various points over the course of history. And also, again, as Chris said, the event. So for one of the, I know in Derek, when I spoke to Derek Leonard, one of the events he highlighted as one of the early Idaho events was a discussion with two representatives from Nigeria, one being Leo Igwe and the other being a liberal Nigerian Christian pastor who was in support of gay rights. So again, these I guess kind of international and kind of cross-cultural events and exchanges and generally kind of awareness raising events. But again, I think the kind of international dimension that Andrew talked about in terms of supporting people seeking asylum and the role of LGBT humanists in the wider international humanist group, which Andrew can probably speak to better than me. But
I mean, I think that it's interesting in the question that the questioner is asking, given the concerning rise that we see in anti-LGBT hate groups in the far right, in the West, and in China and Russia, what can be learned from LGBT Humanists UK struggle history about the struggles of the future? And then we've got another question, haven't we, there, Chris, which is quite similar about whether how LGBT humanists in the UK's experience differed from similar groups in other countries with stronger secular traditions, such as France. I think the French example is really interesting because, of course, there was far greater apparent opposition to same-sex marriage in France than there was in the UK. I mean, don't get me wrong, I mean, I went to speak on platforms and stages throughout the same-sex marriage debates where there was a lot of opposition in the room and there was a big turnout and the Catholics were really out in force in the UK. But in France, it was another level of campaigning against same-sex marriage. So I wouldn't presume, as the questioner does here, that select secular states are necessarily the most hospitable place for gay people. In fact, I think history shows that's not necessarily the case anyway. But I think that what we can learn for other countries' struggles of LGBT people in the context of the UK's experience of LGBT humanists, I think it's very hard to say, because one of the things that's distinctive about everything that Maddie has said and everything that I have said is how intertwined with a certain sort of, generally developing British society these things have been. And I suppose that, Edward Carpenter, like we were saying, wasn't just a gay rights activist. He was an advocate for such a broader platform than that. And a very English sort of socialistic utopian idea. I think that one of the only really universal lessons for people in other countries from LGBT humanist experience, I think, is the value of using human rights as the bedrock of the campaigning work. When I think of all the victories that have been achieved, whether it was adding same-sex orientations to the Equality Act, or the attempts, at least so far, to ban conversion therapy, or the successes of the Gender Recognition Act, or whatever, so many of them have been rooted in growing acceptance and mainstreaming of human rights from the Human Rights Act in 1998 and onwards. That's probably a lesson that you can learn, that there is, if you pursue universal human rights, if you pursue a secular ethic, if you pursue these things, then LGBT rights will come along as a consequence of that social platform. And I think that I said at the beginning, there was both the scientific aspect of a humanist approach that drove us towards these aims, and the moral aspect, the freedom-oriented, the social justice aspect of humanism that drew toward these aims. I think the second does more work than the first, and I think so. It really is the human rights stuff that drives these things forward, and I think that shows in the sort of places like China and Russia, and amongst the far right, that the questioner has picked out for as examples of where LGBT people are threatened today. It's clear that that's part of a wider disdain for human rights and human freedom, freedom of expression and freedom of choice. And so I think probably the lesson is to hitch your wagon to a broader fight for the human rights and freedom of choice of everyone.
Thank you. A question came through saying, I've been campaigning for the Labour Party during the last elections, and the issue of female spaces regarding trans people was raised time and again and resulted in volatile exchanges. The question is asked, how can this be resolved? I rather suspect if any of us had a very single neat answer to that, it would be in circulation by now. And how do lesbians feel about female spaces? I suppose one thing to say, just in an opening response to that, is of course that LGBT Humanists has for some years now been in the most recent case this year the organising group, and in other cases in the past certainly one of the core groups organising the annual Trans Day of Remembrance, which is a ceremony that it is explicitly set up as a secular ceremony, building on all of the insight and knowledge of professional humanist celebrants to create an incredibly moving and fitting tribute to victims of transphobic violence every year. And that takes place in November on the Trans Day of Remembrance. And so LGBT Humanists has been resolute and consistent in its stance of being pro-LGBT, with the T very clearly included within that coalition. And I think it's true to say that we've been sensitive in our best moments, I hope, and in most of the time we've been around, to the fact that the threats that face LGBT people are very seldom easily distinguished from the threats that face the T. And so we've been mindful too that where even in cases like now, where we're fighting trans for a ban on supposed conversion therapy against trans people on gender identity, that so often that targets supposed gender variant and gender non-conforming behaviour. The man who thinks he might be gay and goes to the conversion therapist will often be told to go and perform manly activities and go seek out the non-sexual fellowship of other men, and stop acting like a woman, and stop acting in an effeminate manner, and so on. And so often that very same rhetoric, that very same logic, those very same tropes are of course applied to trans communities. And so I think there's been both a philosophical and a practical commitment to seeing the struggle there as one of coalition. Andrew, you said you might want to add some more to that.
Well, I mean, there's a sort of big general answer like the one that you alluded to there, to the themes behind this question, and then there's a sort of specific answer. I think the big general answer that you give is absolutely right, that there's a strong case for solidarity between people who are fighting for the equal treatment and human rights of lesbian, gay and bisexual people, and people who are fighting for the equal treatment and human rights of transgender people. And in fact, the decision to to change name from the Gay and Lesbian Humanist Association to LGBT Humanists and to add the T was one that was taken before the merger with Humanists UK, actually, by the then still independent GALHA. And it was a democratic decision. It was discussed. And I think that's very right and proper. And it was discussed from different angles, and the decision was made on that basis. And I think that that is true. The specific question of how we might resolve the fact that this situation leads to volatile exchanges and raised temperatures, I think is not. I mean, like you say, Chris, if we had the answer, we would give it, and all those volatile exchanges would be over. Every realization of human rights, and especially every move towards the equal treatment of marginalized people, has always been balanced with other interests of other people in a great balancing of human rights and freedoms over time. And so it's certainly true that often, is something that has to be done. The reason we speak about the freedom and human rights of every person being achieved to the maximum extent possible up to the limits and the rights and freedoms of others is because that's true. That's how you implement human rights in a society where people's interests are divergent and are not the same. All I can say is that, Humanists UK and LGBT humanists are ethical movements for change, for social and political change. And as a result of that, support the freedom of people to make choices about their own lives to the extent that they don't harm others, that we have a long-standing commitment as a result to supporting the human rights and dignity of transgender people and their equal treatment. And we've made that clear a number of times, both in when we supported gender reassignment being included in the 2006 Equality Act, and then recently when we gave support to some modification of the Gender Recognition Act. But we've also made it clear as a policy position that we support that on the understanding that safeguards to ensure the genuine intent of applicants for gender reassignment would be in place, and the Equality Act protections on grounds of sex would be maintained. And that's really, I think, all you can do, all you can say about this is that you can only speak about this issue from a general point of view, because once you get into the specifics, they're so contextual that you need to know the facts of the case before you can make a precise judgment. I think that our position as a campaigning organisation, as an advocacy organisation, has been to say that the Equality Act protections for every group should remain, and there should be ways found, and it is possible to find ways of balancing the rights and freedoms of individuals against each other when there is conflict. But I think the idea is that the approach taken should be one that thinks about and takes seriously the dignity of every person involved, seeks equal treatment to the greatest extent as possible, and seeks to realise the rights of each person involved in any potential trade-off. And that, to the extent that the question is asking how can this be resolved, referring to the situation that he describes, I think that's how it can be resolved. What the resolution will be, if that process is applied and those principles are applied, I don't know. But at the moment, I don't think that those principles are commonly being applied, and that instead a lot of external ideas, priorities, arguments, conflicts are being imported into some of these areas of discussion, and I don't think that is helpful.
It can often feel like it's a proxy of something that's a more of an anxiety somewhere upstream of that particular debate. I'm also conscious the questioner did ask about did name check lesbians as a particular group of concern. I'm not going to add anything at all to what Andrew said. I fully agree. I think I see no other natural opportunity than now to signpost and flag how prominent lesbians have been in the group of LGBT humanists and in its longer history. And I obviously can defer to Maddie in particular, as well as to Andrew on that. But we've long had very, very powerful patrons who are gay or bisexual women, the likes of Maureen Duffy, Sandy Toksvig, and Angela Eagle need no introduction. And then, of course, back in history, very, very prominent indeed, queer female humanists like Zora Neale Hurston and Virginia Woolf and so on. Maddie, I'm very much treading on your territory there, so I wonder if there's anything else you wanted to say.
Oh, you're doing a good job. You're treading on my territory, but with panache. Yeah, I mean, as you say, it is important to note that that is the case, and that there have been lots of really remarkable women involved in the history, both of the organisation and the longer history as well. As you say, Maureen Duffy is the kind of I suppose being the first president of the Gay Humanist Group is an important kind of touch point, I suppose. But as you quite rightly say, there have been many others, both within and without the organisation, that we could also point to. I mean, as you say, I didn't talk about Woolf and other members of the Bloomsbury Circle, didn't mention kind of more that broader or wider history within both the history of humanism and the history of LGBT activism. But it is something that's very much there. And it was actually something that came up. I was wondering whether to mention it actually in the talk, but there wasn't really time. But when I gave a talk a while ago on Clementina and Struther Thompson and Vernon Lee, for the International Vernon Lee Society, and Clementina and Struther Thompson was a member of one of the ethical societies. Her and Vernon Lee were in both a romantic and long-term creative intellectual partnership for many years, and that there was other examples of women like those two who were members of the ethical societies also. And when this came up in the context of the talk, somebody asked whether perhaps the ethical societies had provided a kind of, a safe, welcoming space for lesbians and gay people, earlier on as we said, then the emergence of the kind of self-consciously gay humanist group. And again, drawing on what Andrew said about the kind of foundations of humanism as a philosophy and as a kind of active organisation, I think that's very much true. I think there's a reason that we can find plenty of evidence of that in the membership of the ethical societies as they then were and the humanist groups as they became, as well as within LGBT Humanist itself. So I suppose that would be one thing I would add. Thank you.
A question perhaps that might be a nice point to end, and I wonder if between us, and I'm sure lots of people in the call as this is going live will have lots and lots of answers. But Annie Rood has asked if you could suggest one book to read on the philosophy behind humanism, what would it be? I was about to, right on cue there. Yes, The Little Book of Humanism.
The Little Book of Humanism, an excellent book. All royalties go to Humanists UK for every copy that you buy. That's the best one. It's the cheapest too.
There you go. You heard it here first. Thank you very, very much, everyone, for such an invigorating set of questions and such an interesting set of comments, Maddie and Andrew. Thank you very, very much indeed.